I'm Jaime Oxales, a second-year biology student of the Far Eastern University, and I'm going to talk about the concept of heroism with reference to overseas Filipino workers, or OFWs, and give my thoughts about former President Corazon Aquino hailing them as mga bagong bayani in her speech in 1988 during the rise of labor exports from the Philippines. To start off, I'll talk about what caused the rise of labor exports in the first place. Filipino workers sought out employment overseas for two reasons. Firstly, the Philippines was suffering severe economic decline due to the immense debt the country amassed under the administration of former President Ferdinand Marcos, who, in the midst of the oil crisis in 1973 and 1979, which adversely affected the country's economy that was highly dependent on imported oil, extensively borrowed foreign funds to put on a facade by artificially boosting the domestic growth of the economy. Secondly, the global market for temporary labor, such as those for domestic helpers and entertainers, was growing due to globalization and the industrialization of our neighboring countries. So how then did the rise of labor exports lead to coining the term bagong bayani? Heroes are generally perceived as courageous individuals admired for carrying out noble deeds that no ordinary individual would otherwise do. On the other hand, amongst the Filipino people, what constitutes a hero are acts of suffering and martyrdom. The religious, historical, and political aspects of the Philippines eulogize respectively the suffering of Jesus Christ, Jose Rizal, and former President Corazon Aquino herself. Consistently, OFWs back then were suffering from abuse and human rights violation. But suffering alone would not merit being called a hero. So what then prompted President Corazon Aquino to regard OFWs as mga bagong bayani of the Philippines? What were the fruits of their suffering and for whom were they for? Well, simply put, the fruit was the remittance that they sent back to the Philippines, the beneficiaries of which were not only their families but also their nation that was buried deeply in debt. What then was President Corazon Aquino's motive for calling OFWs as mga bagong bayani? Was it to inspire not only them but the rest of the population amidst the country's economic issues? Or was it a mere response to put off the bad press that the government was getting due to their continued support toward overseas employment despite their inadequate capability to provide protection to OFWs? One way or another, the economy of the Philippines was suffering immensely, and it is undeniable that the remittances sent back by OFWs at that time helped put the rest of the country back on its feet. It can be argued that the OFWs were being commodified and taken advantage of by the Philippine state while maliciously being praised and hailed as heroes. But what other option did the Philippines have back then to survive and overcome its enormous foreign debt crisis? Furthermore, where would OFWs otherwise find work within the country if the country did not have an economy to begin with? Nevertheless, the Philippine government under President Corazon Aquino did not neglect its OFWs, as they took legislative measures to ensure the welfare and protection of the overseas workers. President Corazon Aquino appealed to the emotion of the enduring Filipino people, not to exploit the people themselves, but to exploit the only opportunity to revive the country's economy and subsequently the welfare of its people. To sum up, former President Ferdinand Marcos left the Philippine economy in shambles and its people in a dark age. In darkness, however, the Filipino people saw a glint of hope. Those that were courageous reached out and grabbed the blooming opportunities in foreign lands, the fruits of which nourished not only their own families but also their fellow countrymen. Former President Corazon Aquino merely acknowledged their Filipino-esque heroism and provided them rightfully with support and protection at a time when leaving one's own country did not signify leaving behind one's fellow countrymen.